from an undisclosed location in the Great Western Desert in the land of the free and autonomous Native American people. The 2024 presidential campaign in exile to return all U.S. land back to their rights owners. This is the Ben Zion Podcast.
Techno-communism will win.
Welcome back to the Techno-Communism Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Zion, and I'm going to start off with a poem that was written by ChatGPT, and it's a cautionary tale, and I think pretty elegant. It's a poem about the destruction of climate change, and I asked for a specific kind of work, and that's what it gave me, and I think it's pretty artful. Probably not going to be winning any prizes, but I'll let you be the judge. It's called Prayer for the Damned. Every night she says a prayer for the damned, for those caught in the midst of nature's demand. As the skies turn red and the oceans rise, she watches in horror as the world slowly dies. Acid rain, a deluge of flames, the earth's anger unleashed, no one to blame. Forests destroyed, species wiped out, as humanity's greed leaves nothing but doubt. The ice caps melt, the temperature soar, Mother Nature's warning an ominous roar, but still we ignore, still we deny the very existence of our planet's cry. Every night she says a prayer for the damned, for those whose homes have been turned to sand, for those who suffer, for those who grieve, for the construction we cannot conceive. We must act now before it's too late, before we seal our planet's fate. Let us pray not just for the damned, but for the world for which we all stand. I've heard worse. I've heard worse written by professional poets. That's pretty good there, ChatGPT. I played with the ChatGPT app a little bit, and it does work, but I'm not going to get into that too much. But you can use an app now as well as a web-based service. You have to be logged in to ChatGPT for those things. Paris Marx, a tech critic, and I don't know exactly his views on universal super longevity or on the prospect of Marxist tech accelerationism. I've tried to put those to him in mostly in meme form. His response was very little. He doesn't just respond to comments. But I would imagine that he is probably a Marxist tech accelerationist if as this thing begins to unfold. I've mentioned him, I think, before as somebody who has the right idea about criticisms of the fascist capture of tech sectors across the Western world, and most particularly in the United States, the ringleader of this very climate apocalypse. Imagine that there is a country that is forcing the rest of the Earth's 8 billion people. There's only 400 million people in the U.S. and about 1 billion in the white Western world. So imagine that this fascist ringleader were forcing everyone else to their doom. This is something like from a comic book supervillain, but it's not in fact a work of fiction. It is the reality that you live in. And I was posting some of this kind of content about climate change and relating it to anti-fascist action and alluding to the ideas of techno-communism with a meme that I've shared many times in this. Those are not getting a lot of views compared to what they were. My accounts are getting slowed, and I'm shadow banned for no real reason at all, except for telling you that this climate apocalypse is occurring because of capitalists. Capitalists control all of these media sectors to a high degree, and they can see that you will not be able to share those kind of messages. Aaron Brockovich, a certain kind of truth teller about environmental destruction, but one a little more of the capitalist class, perhaps, not an avowed revolutionary communist in any way, has been flagged by Democrats, the people who are supposed to be the better ones on ending the climate apocalypse, has been flagged by Democrats recently. This is an article that was circulating as a potential climate terrorist. That's to say that the events around the East Palestine, southern environmental disaster what looked like a massive atom bomb exploding over Ohio has led to a lot more climate protest and action, and rightly so. And but Democrats, liberals, do not characterize the for-profit railway system that cut corners and ultimately blew up this atom bomb style explosion over a large part of the United States. They do not characterize them as environmental terrorists. It's quite vexing that the people who are poisoning your planet are granted legitimacy and protection by the government, and the people who want to see that you are not poisoned are referred to as terrorists and extremists and so forth. That's not suitable, and you're all victims of that in many, many ways. The entirety of civil society is arranged in this way to protect the elites, to harm you as an unfortunate side effect of that violent protection of private wealth. And this is, I'll read an article that describes, in part this article I'll read, that describes an effect. This is much more established science than most of the things that I talk about on this program, which I hope will become established science, but generally it's emerging disciplines, often to do with computer science, but things that have, I believe, revolutionary potential in the decades to come, and so much so that they would be the defining elements of 21st century history. This is yet another catastrophic plague event on the horizon, and this is established science that this is closely connected to climate change and other lack of environmental protections. As I mentioned on a couple of other shows, there's a lot of talk around your water cooler about how a Chinese wet market was the source of the coronavirus, which is an absolute falsehood. This is based on speculation of one person working for fascists, a health official in the U.S. Who said, someone asked them, apropos of nothing, where did this come from? And they said, well, we don't know, but we think it might have come from this source. And they're just making stuff up, and it became the number one talking point around the world on this. This disease, we now know, predates by at least 18 months the Wuhan outbreak. So it did not come from a lab in Wuhan, nor did it come from a Chinese wet market. Both of those things are just calculated misinformation to make you blame Chinese people for the problems of Western affluence. To talk about wet markets in this way, there's thousands and thousands of wet markets. There's 10 grocery stores within a few miles of you, in all likelihood, that are sharing a disease vector in the form of processed animal products, most notably butchered animal flesh. This is a major disease vector, and there's many other things of this kind that we happily disregard because it's more important that the people of the West have luxury products than it is to save the planet. And I say people of the West because those billion Westerners are the overwhelming beneficiaries of this unnecessary factory farming set of systems yet again, the number two cause of climate change, a major cause of the same order of magnitude of environmental devastation besides, is something that is upheld by fascist sympathizers like yourself. You're driving around in an SUV eating a cheeseburger right now. That's probably you. You could just as easily be eating a cheeseburger that tastes exactly the same. That's not made from those things. It's not contributing to you're possibly getting sick. You get food poisoning pretty routinely if you're eating this kind of product. You're contributing to others in that situation, but also creating a fertile field for pandemic type effects that could easily be avoided by cleaning this world up, and that means removing livestock systems which are killing the planet. There's an article from the New York Times. We study virus evolution. Here's where we think the coronavirus is going. As scientists who study how viruses evolve, we often are asked about the future of the coronavirus. Will it go away, get worse, fade into the background of our lives, become seasonal like the flu? You can see that the New York Times is already kind of low-key pushing this State Department propaganda. All they do is propagandize in various ways on behalf of the State Department. that this is not so bad and it can just become something that's ignored, seasonal, like the flu. But millions of people are dead. How many people died in China? Even with a sharp uptick for a couple of weeks, still only about 85,000 people are dead across all of China. 1.4 billion people, and 84,000 are dead. How many people are dead in the United States? Well, they've been not releasing the data, and they've been juking the stats to make you think that less people have died, so they just strip people from the records. Every day they're doing this. That's why it's the number of deaths of airborne pathogens and respiratory problems has stayed in the thousands per day for the last few years, and yet the numbers stay stubbornly. The total number stays stubbornly around 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 million. That's because they're lying, not including all of the deaths. They're stripping away the numbers of deaths of people who were previously included, and they're just not even publicizing it. They're not talking about it. If you ask the average person on the bus, what do you think about the coronavirus? They said, well, lucky for us, the coronavirus is over. I have a vaccine now, which is a Band-Aid on a gaping gunshot wound. Thousands of people dying every day. And the New York Times is one of these publications. It's instrumental in pushing imperialist propaganda to a high degree, but also any kind of propaganda that the State Department wants. And they'll just make it sound as if it's just an afterthought, or just an aside or a counterpoint, playing the devil's advocate. But it's none of those things. It's them expressly serving the whims of the fascist overlords. The Omicron variant was significantly more infectious and more resistant to vaccines than the original strain that first emerged in Wuhan. This is from 2022. We know that this strain did not come from Wuhan. It was just first documented there. There were examples in the U.S. and it was found in Europe prior to that time. This rash of popcorn lung deaths of 2019 that were they were saying people are mysteriously dying from vaping. They weren't dying from vaping; they were dying from coronavirus. It just hadn't been identified yet because symptoms were quite unclear. The coronavirus variants that have emerged thus far sample only a fraction of the genetic space that is more likely to become available for evolutionary exploration. Now, shifting gears to science.org. From Black Death to fatal flu, past pandemics show why people on the margins suffer most. Yes. And if you want to know why the United States, why smug white capitalists in the United States will harass you for wearing a mask and tell you that you're not free because you are advocating for a lockdown type situation, that would have been a short-lived scenario. Had it been done properly, we would have been already well clear of this many years ago. If the United States, the fascist U.S., again putting pressure on the rest of the world to do exactly the wrong thing. Why do they do this? It's just because they're dumb? No. It's because they want to kill working people. Because they know that the United States is more than ready for a revolution against their fascist misdeeds, of which there are many. 100 million people killed over 150 years by the military-industrial complex and its predecessor mechanisms. For what did those people do? Well, they committed the most heinous crime of wanting to build a humane and sustainable economic system in their countries. And those are overwhelmingly black and brown people. Not those billion white people who are the beneficiaries of all of these fascist actions to a high degree. Just as they will kill 100 million people without even trying to obfuscate any of that, or obfuscating it only just a little, they'll openly murder them and say it's in the fight against communism. They will murder their own citizens in slightly more sneaky set of ways to avoid similar revolutionary outcomes, to lessen the possibility of people taking action against this most successful fascist state in history. The United States is a fascist state, and it's the most successful fascist state because it's continued to do this sort of thing for 100 plus years. It was a fascist state on which other fascist states were modeled. Political philosophers, such as they were of the early 20th century around Europe, looked at the United States and they said, we like what these concentration camps did to Native Americans. We like what these genocidal actions did to Native Americans and African Americans and continued to do at that time. we like this murdering of people a lot because we're fascists. So we'll model our governance on these things. We'll emulate this master fascist. The master fascist was never punished. The United States dropped a nuclear weapon on one of these fascist collaborators. So the world was able to say, well, they're not the fascists, they're fighting the fascists. But the real reason that the United States dropped this nuclear weapon was to send a message. No one challenges this fascist power, even though we all just fought against other fascists of very, very similar kind. The United States, very reluctantly so, it waited a number of years before entering that fray. There was a pro-fascist movement of a very, very large kind, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people marching in Times Square, in Madison Square Garden, gathering in favor of fascism. They liked the fact that undesirables were being murdered by fascists, and that's central to the American psyche, is this kind of targeting of underclasses, most particularly black and brown folks. And people will never. You can turn on the History Channel, call it the Hitler Channel, practically, and watch this kind of thing all day long. But there's a huge number of genocidal actions in this country, and a huge number of genocidal actions in the global South, perpetrated by these same powers, European powers in the United States, the fascist West, that are not discussed, because it's only fascism when it happens to white people, right? When it happens to brown people, it's something that we would prefer to ignore. It's just this fact of life that we will downplay. And this is true of this 21st century form of genocide, which is this medical genocide that's occurred in recent years. And when you say, Ben, it's just too bad. This is just how the country is. No, it's not too bad. Native American life expectancy has gone down by 8.5 years in the past 3 years. It's gone through the floor. And who are Native Americans? They're the rightful owners of this continent. They're the people that have the right to challenge fascist power in this country. And because they have that right, they have been targeted by all manner of attack, undermining the integrity of their communities in a wide variety of ways, aside from actual violence, for as long as anyone can remember, well outside the living memory. As we said, fascists were looking at things that were going on in the late 1800s that were targeting Native Americans and African Americans. This has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, and you know this, but yet you don't call the United States a fascist country. And then that's because in the public imagination, it's only fascism when it happens to white people. When it happens to darker skinned people, and even greater numbers, far greater numbers than the number of people that were killed in Europe during World War II. That's just a fact. There's genocidal actions of that scale. One specific genocidal action of that scale on the African continent, perpetrated by Europeans. But when you look at all of these, you're talking about many millions of deaths, much larger. And it's not a competition, right? But this is not something. There's not a Hitler Channel that broadcasts this kind of thing all day long that focuses on the murder of black and brown people. You can find some Twitter accounts, but they're relatively small compared to a platform like the Hitler Channel. So it's out and out insanity. The ways that European people, white Americans, will bend over backwards to ignore this kind of thing, so we say, why is there umbrage about masks? I'm not the world's most flexible person. It takes me a second to bend over and put on socks. Sometimes it takes me 30 seconds. It takes me a long time. How long does it take me to put on a mask? I grab it when I'm going outside leaving the house, and I have it on before I've locked the door. It takes a half a second. So is this a hardship? Are people protesting wearing socks? Do you see white people with big fat beer bellies who are angry, screaming at a camera, telling you that you shouldn't have to wear socks, that that's a crime against humanity? No. What are these people really doing? They're expressing this privileged position, this genocidal position of murdering black and brown folks and working people all across the spectrum, but it unfortunately targets a very high number of black and brown folks. As I said, Native American life expectancy has gone down by almost a decade the last 3 years. That's almost unprecedented for community to, the general life expectancy is down in the U.S. By a much smaller number. It's 8 times as much a death among Native Americans as in the general population. And a similar, not quite as high of a number, but a similar fall off amongst African Americans and other marginalized communities. The working poor are being targeted, and the narratives are not about that fact. It's not about protecting these people. It's not about having a public health service to do the basic job of taking care of people. It's about these crypto-fascistic narratives about how you would be unfree in this scenario where that is done. And that is because fascists want to be free to overwhelmingly murder working people, most particularly black and brown folks, who would be the righteous revolutionaries in this slightly better world where all of these dirty deeds are not being done, more or less out in the open. But they have the thinnest veneer of plausibility and legitimacy to them, whitewashing these horrors. And the United States Transhumanist Party, I was elected the president